Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I am joined again by Swithun Dobson, and this sort of is riffing off some private discussions we had about my beliefs in Christian pacifism, and it seemed like DMing wasn't necessarily the best way to have the kind of conversation Swithun wanted. So why don't you go ahead and open up with what you have, Swithun? You're muted.
There we go. So, I'm going to move on to my sheet. So the first question I have for you, Todd, is what does pacifism look like in the raising of children, in particular in the context of discipline? Is spanking okay? What about grounding? What kind of things are open to the pacifist parent?
Yeah. I think one thing that needs to be clear is that when you look at Christian, so for example, with libertarians with the non-aggression principle, there's this debate over, is spanking aggression against children? Because that's sort of derivative of a first principle that you extrapolate everything from. Whereas extrapolating it from a teaching of Christ within a specific context doesn't necessarily lead to the same sort of all-encompassing extrapolation. So, for example, the same Bible that says, turn the other cheek also says, spare the rod, spoil the child. And so, obviously, some forms of corporal punishment would probably be questionable, like, I don't know, boxing someone's ears or excessive, caning maybe. But something like putting somebody, there's two kinds of punishment in a sense. Or three, the application of force, the withdrawal of some service. So you don't get to eat tonight, you don't get candy, you don't do whatever. So you're not giving them something, or you're making them do something, like they have to clean up or they have to do something as a punishment for what they've done. Obviously, the latter two wouldn't really be problematic because since the application of force seems to be the issue here, those are just either withholding what you already have or requiring them to do something to compensate for what they've done. But I don't think things like spanking are intrinsically incompatible. So, for example, it's not so much that you can't apply force at all, it's that you can't kill people, and parents aren't hopefully going to kill their children.
So, your understanding... Okay, so what, in your view, would be in general, because obviously there will be contexts that would determine what might be appropriate and what might not be. What would you say would be sort of like the minimum amount of force inflicted on a child, which would be at the level which you would consider wrong?
I mean, I think the minimum amount of violence that would be objectionable would be one that would maim or cripple the child. I mean, anything less than that isn't right. What's the intent of the force? Is it to correct or to harm? So maiming the child, like putting their hands on a burner or breaking bones or bruising and welting, with like a cane, probably, not that.
So what's the distinction then between, in your view, sort of appropriate force against a child and what is inappropriate? What determines the distinction for you on that?
Well, the inappropriate force against a child would be a force meant to do grievous bodily harm or death. That would range from maiming and crippling to killing. That's obviously illicit, and I think almost anybody would agree with that principle. The other principle then is, well, when is it justified? Well, if it's towards the end of correcting their behavior towards the desired outcome. So using certain kinds of force to get them to do something that's criminal or immoral while falling short of grievous bodily harm or death would still be objectionable because you're using that to coerce the child to do something immoral. And the reason why, at least with children, some measure of force is required is they're essentially animals. I mean, you don't reason with a dog, you slap it upside the head if it, pees in the house. So eventually, but unlike dogs, children do grow up to the point where you can use reason. And then at some point, there's force, reason and force, and then just reason. And that depends on the precocity of the child.
So if a child became, let's suppose they're still in your household and were particularly reasonable at a particular age, it doesn't matter what age it is, they're still within your household and still under your sort of roof. Would that then make the physical punishment illicit, or would it just reduce the circumstances in which you would probably use it?
Yeah, it wouldn't render it illicit. It would probably render it less likely to be needed. A lot of it has to do with, prudence. So, for example, one punishment might work for one child, but not another. A sufficiently sensitive child might be better convinced of the error of his ways through withholding something, maybe, rather than, the spanking. Whereas a less sensitive child and one is a little more cold-blooded, that might be more appropriate for their misbehavior.
Okay, that seems to have answered that, I think, quite well. So the second question I had was this. According to the anthropologist Dr. David Gilmour, he looks at lots of cultures historically and finds that there are sort of 3 P's of manhood, which he says are procreation, provision, and protection. So my question based on this then is, does a pacifist position then to some extent feminize men and digitally make marriage then less desirable for women because her husband will then refuse to provide one of the traditional benefits of marriage?
I think the way this question is framed is not sufficiently clear because protection is on a spectrum. So let's say, for example, I think anybody who has children, especially teenage children, would know that sending young women out without a chaperone is not protecting them. They're more vulnerable to being taken advantage of. So, send a brother, send a cousin, or go yourself to make sure that nothing, befalls her. She doesn't do anything foolish. That's a kind of protection. It's not protection. It's more of a protection against poor decision making or deception on someone else's part. Then there's protection in the sense that the physical protection by providing clothes and shelter so that the child is not exposed, the wife is not exposed to the elements. Okay, so far so good. We can still do that. Now, then it gets to this one aspect of protection, using violent force if necessary to preserve the life of your wife and child. Now, that's only one kind of protection, and a lot of the other kinds are already done anyhow. And then the question is, well, if you don't do that, are you still protecting? Well, this is where it's a matter of faith, because if you look at, what works and what doesn't, we can go into statistics. But ultimately, that doesn't necessarily persuade people because there's this intuitive sense that, well, you go shoot the guy that comes in. Part of the problem, though, is that it's begging the question because there's a lot of scenarios in which that would be absolutely disastrous. I think you saw my debate on the gospel truth. So at the end, I mentioned the Soviet soldier invading this particular house in Berlin. Obviously, the sort of classic American shoot him at the door wouldn't have worked at all. It would have led to everybody getting killed. And so the form of protection that was exerted was trying to reach empathetically to the soldier, which worked. It was probably the only course of action that could have been taken that would not yield immediate death. So again, I mean, that is a form of protection. It may not be the form of protection that someone is completely satisfied with. And then also, the people who make the claim, would you use force to protect someone, is harder to take it too seriously because once you engage in a situation in which you start to threaten to use force, it can easily escalate out of control for both sides. And unless you are trained tactically, it's beyond foolhardy to do that. And most people who make such claims and insist on such normative behavior themselves are not trained tactically. So if you then engage in such a situation, you're more likely to do more harm than good. And even those who are tactically trained would also argue, do that as a last resort. Don't go guns blazing the first situation that takes place. So I say that protection is on a spectrum from depending on what's the threat. Is it want and poverty and scarcity? Is it deception from other people? Is it from foolish choices? Is it from wild animals? Is it from environmental factors? All of which the pacifist father would do. And against somebody who wants some individual human being that wants to do violent harm, there are non-lethal forms of protection, which, but given the nature of the axiomatic commitments, would have to be what is used.
Okay, so let's suppose that somebody is tactically trained. And let's suppose it's not a situation of invading army, but rather one of a robbery or some sort of individual, sort of criminal behavior, as opposed to sort of like invasion. Because, yeah, clearly in that situation, attempting to attack the Soviet soldier probably wasn't going to work. So that makes clear sense. But suppose you're trained tactically, and suppose someone comes to rob you, and then for whatever reason, it doesn't matter, they decide that they want to try to attempt to kill your children or your wife. I mean, some of the farm murders in South Africa, for example, have followed this sort of pattern. So let's suppose that's a situation. You are trained tactically. Why would it be wrong to prevent the attack physically on your children and your wife if you were trained tactically and you had a high probability that the outcome would render the threat neutral? Now, whether this involved killing them isn't necessarily the point, but you would maim them to such an extent that they could no longer continue the attack. Why would that be wrong? And my additional question is, if women who are potentially marrying you knew that you wouldn't be willing to engage in this kind of behavior to neutralize a threat, would this then reduce the value of marriage to her?
Well, there's a few ways to go with this question. The one is the actual fact of the matter is that marriage rates have not suffered amongst communities that have held to this principle. So not only is it a theoretical question, it's a practical question, and the theoretical implications of the practical question haven't developed in the way that this question is framed to get at. And then the other question is, what would be wrong with incapacitating this invader violently? Well, I mean, again, this gets back to the prior commitments. If we're dealing with is the question sort of pragmatic question, or is it a question of principle? So for obvious reasons, everybody has a set of principles that they live by that other people would think living by them in situation X is foolhardy and will get you killed. And yet everybody has them, and it seems to work sort of well across the board.
My question about marriage is one of a ceteris paribus question, as opposed to marriage rates in pacifist communities, because there are other factors which would alter the marriage rates and the desirability of them in those situations. So my question is whether you held everything else constant and you refused to provide such a service if you were able to do and it was prudent to do so, would they in that case then reduce the desirability of marriage, and then as a consequence, to some extent argue you could feminize men? And in addition, what, again, to repeat the question, is what is wrong with incapacitating them on a principled ground if the probability of the results are going to prevent a serious criminal act taking place?
Well, the reason why it's wrong, without going into all the details of the debate that I've already had, is that it contradicts the teachings of Christ. Now, the question then is, marriage, ceteris paribus, provides a whole lot of obligations and values, not just one. And when you get, it depends on what you're expecting out of the marriage, right? If marriage if it's defined in a certain context with a certain set of values and obligations, then yeah, I mean, they'll have different expectations. So I don't think it's really a fair question to say, well, if it doesn't do this, because maybe, okay, let's say hypothetically that P question is statistically not as protection, not as quote efficient unquote as others, but let's say they overcompensate in some other area, like affection and pair bonding, in which regard, if somebody, you know, won't treat you as well as this person, in fact, this person treats you better than everyone else, then that would outweigh in the rational decision-making process. Because I mean, you could imagine the converse, a person who's very violent and would protect you and pick a fight at the drop of a hat, but is also abusive and dislikes you, or at least dislikes you some of the time. And so, well, if you then weigh that out, it's like, well, maybe that guy's not such a desirable husband after all.
Yes, again, clearly you could compensate from on various levels, but all my point would be is if you refuse to provide a particular service, even if you are able to do so, then that would reduce the desirability of marriage, ceteris paribus. And of course, you can compensate for other things, but just holding everything else constant, that would seem to follow. Secondly, with the incapacitation situation of an intruder into your property, supposing that you could prevent them from performing the criminal act with force which was equal to the amount of force that was legitimate to discipline a child, would that be legitimate in that context? Or would you take a qualitatively different approach to parents and children than those between other adults? And if so, on what basis?
Now, as far as the last question, you know, to what extent could non-lethal force be used? I haven't really given that much thought. I suppose, you know, again, it's on a spectrum. Obviously, they're not children anymore; they're adults. But I think that the use of force on other adults within this framework, within this context, becomes increasingly problematic because they're no longer under your authority, and in the case of a child, and whereas the New Testament doesn't seem to indicate that you should remove the Old Testament teachings with regarding to child rearing, at least it doesn't directly contradict them. I don't think that using force, even non-lethal force in that case, it depends. I mean, if you have a taser and you shoot the guy, I mean, is that okay? I mean, maybe. I mean, he's not dead and he's just got knocked out by a taser. But then again, that runs the risk of escalation because tasers look like guns, and the person might then decide to react more aggressively than he would have otherwise. But this line of inquiry really is very much like what libertarians complain about when someone says, well, if you can't initiate force with taxes to pay for national defense, how are you going to defend yourselves? And ceteris paribus, that means the state's more desirable than a libertarian society, because a libertarian society couldn't provide defense. I mean, the libertarians object. I would object to this line of questioning on the same grounds that libertarians would object to a similar form of it vis-a-vis national defense.
Well, funny you should say about national defense. Let's go to that question now, because I had it in anyway later, but we can do it now anyway because you brought it up. How can the pacifist community defend itself from external threats without compromising their principles?
Okay, so then we have to ask ourselves, what are the nature of the threat? So presumably a foreign invasion. So when the short of it is pay the protection money. And throughout history, that tends to be one of the most successful ways to survive. During the raids of Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, armed resistance was futile and would lead to your city being burned to the ground. Whereas paying the protection money often spared you and everyone else. It's not the ultimately most desirable situation, but it's better than a lot of the alternatives that developed. So that's one way. You just pay the protection money and that they'll leave you alone. Second of all, within the concept of Christianity, relying on the protection of God, because at some level, no matter what position the Christian takes on violence, they're never going to be completely secure one way or the other, and they rely on the protection of God. So we would just have to rely more. And then secondarily, the policy that I've mentioned in private elsewhere of the principle of indispensability, where you're indispensable to the people around you. Usually, I think I've identified strategically 4 things: education, medicine, food, and various technical professions. And if you do that, you can then create an incentive where the cost of getting rid of you is so high that while they could do it, they choose not to. So a case in point of this actually working would be in Paraguay in the 1930s during the Civil War, during the Bolivian invasion, where the Mennonite colonies were caught between the two of them, and they pursued a policy of non-intervention and picking no favorites, and provided medical services. And so both armies decided, well, it's in our interest to keep them around because we're not really in a position to give proper medical treatment to our troops in these exposed positions. And because they are these neutral party actors, they can then mediate between it. We've also seen similar strategies in Brazil with Pentecostals, where the gangs and the police are in a cutthroat struggle, and they're the only ones that can be intermediaries between them. And so in that situation, taking up arms, they have to pick one side or the other and leave them open to a lot of violence that they're not currently exposed to. So I think a ensemble of these strategies not only could work, but in some sense has worked over the years.
Okay, so let's to start with take the
indispensability.
Thank you. The indispensability argument, or the paying the protection money argument. If that would work for the pacifist community, would that not then work for the libertarian anarchist community?
Absolutely. It would absolutely work for them.
If that's the case, though, wouldn't then most of your critique about the libertarian anarchist community not being able to provide national defense, whilst they themselves may not provide it, but they would be sufficiently protected, wouldn't that render most of your argument for that then mute?
Well, okay, there's two parts to this question here. When you look at the libertarian attempts to provide national defense, so like the book that was published, I think 15 years ago, The Myth of National Defense, was an ensemble of articles from people like Murray Rothbard and Walter Block and others. They were claiming that Bob Murphy especially in his book Chaos Theory claims that they could provide the same kind of national defense that something like the United States or England or Germany or Russia could provide, only better. Now, that is the kind of defense that I'm arguing they cannot provide. Now, in a discussion I had with David Friedman, we were talking about decentralized methods of defense. His idea was a large militia with a small elite professional army. Yeah. I mean, I think the discussion I had with David, we sort of agree that something like that could work. It's certainly the kind. So it really, what do the libertarians mean by national defense? If they mean what David Friedman means, something more minimalistic, something that's not directly competing with our idea of like a U.S. carrier task force that can just pull up and bomb a city back to the Stone Age. Yeah, sure, but that's not the argument people like Walter Block and Bob Murphy were making. They were making the claim that, if we were to fight, if libertarian Ancapistan was to fight the U.S., to quote Bob Murphy, it would be the conquistadors and the Incas reversed, where the libertarians would be the conquistadors with the advanced weapons, and the U.S. would be the Incas. I'm like, no, that's where my objection lies.
Okay, that clears that. Let's take an example of the Mennonites in America at the moment. Is their policy of basically free riding on the provision of defense from the American military, is that inconsistent with pacifist principles?
No, because in the Christian theological context, Romans 13, the state is given the authority to serve the sword, to use the sword, and the Christian is commanded to obey the state insofar as the state does not command the Christian to do anything contrary to God. And this is a sort of a strange argument, because then anybody who isn't actively serving in the U.S. Armed Forces is free riding. But very few people take that tack. In fact, very few people within the United States are actively serving in the armed forces, and those that aren't are not considered necessarily free riders. You and I both object to the draft, so the idea that people that would be draft dodgers are free riders would not be the line you're going with here. So we can ignore that possible meaning. So then is somebody who isn't actively serving in the armed forces or chooses not to for whatever reason free riding? Well, most people would say no, and it's only in this very narrow context that it comes up.
My mind has gone blank. So the distinction. So we go to this issue. So would you say then it is wrong for the Christian to use a sword, but not for the state? And if so, why can't the Christian be a member of the state? Because otherwise you might get what seems to be an odd conclusion that on what you might, I think, well, general pacifists would say, you have a higher sort of moral calling following Christ, and you have those principles, and they're sort of higher and better than those which are sort of utilized by the state or generically pagans, just referred to as non-Christians, just as pagans, which they can make use of. So you would have the situation whereby there's this higher moral principle that we should live by, but what we need is other people who don't live by them to sort stuff out for us.
Well, okay, so one line, I wasn't quite sure what you meant. Did you mean that it sounded like at one point you were criticizing the Quaker position where they don't take up the sword, but they hold government office? I would say that's not a consistent position. You'd have to reject it entirely. And second of all, it's not so much the way of thinking about it isn't so much that we need them. If everybody were to become like us, we wouldn't need the state. But it's more like we're an occupied people paying tribute to the overlords. So, I mean, they're just there and they're extracting value from us, and there's really not a lot we can do about it.
But would you say that, at least in principle, that an occupying force is providing a benefit to the pacifist community insofar as they are being they are preventing them from being invaded, and the means by which they require to prevent said invasion is ones that the pacifist community would then themselves reject.
To that question, I would give the response that Walter Block gave in The Myth of National Defense. He says that if the state is to protect us from our property, and then through taxation, it then confiscates us from our property, it's not actually providing the service that it says it's going to provide. And so by the same token, if it's occupying us and extracting value from us in order to protect us from other people doing it, I would take the Block answer to this one.
Okay, let's take this example then. Let's suppose we have a world which has pacifist communities around the world, bar one, which let's call the Neo-Mongols. And let's suppose Neo-Mongols have not invaded any other places as of yet, and they can potentially and they are intending to attack you and invade you and enslave you. We'll also say that the Mongols do not, for whatever reason, deem you indispensable, nor do they consider you, nor will they accept your tribute money for whatever reason. Do you have any means of defending yourself?
Well, with a scenario like that, I don't think hardly anybody could defend themselves, because IRL, the Mongols, did pretty much level everybody that went up against them. And furthermore, given the awful track record of taking up arms against the Mongols, it's not at all clear that this method would be any less of a failure. Usually, making the Mongols mad is a lot worse than not doing anything at all. So I'd say, ceteris paribus, given the Mongol mentality, we would be as on parity with or slightly better than other societies that would use some spectrum of violence against them.
Well, okay, so let's take the Neo-Mongol mentality out of it. They want to invade you just because you have resources that they want, and they don't want you to be there, and they want to enslave you to mine them, for example. Would you, in that case, you still wouldn't have any? I mean, and let's also suppose that, you know, in principle, if you were not a pacifist community, you would be able to defend yourself to some extent. Let's suppose it's a relatively small aggressive tribe and you have relative parity in numbers. Doesn't then the pacifist community have a relative defect to the non-pacifist community when it comes to defense? So imagine, okay, let's say in this world of pacifist communities, let's suppose you have some libertarian anarchist communities which will defend themselves in self-defense, but they don't invade anybody else. Everything else being equal, surely the ones who are prepared to defend themselves are going to have a lower chance of being invaded than those who won't.
So okay, there's a few things here. So let's go look at the you know, so the first question you said, the last question rather, is if one side won't protect itself and the other side will, then ceteris paribus, which one is better? But so sorry. The thing is then, well, I don't know what you mean by that, because in the one sense, what do they want? What are these invaders wanting? So, for example, if they want the libertarian resources but not the pacifist community's resources, then not doing anything is just a wash, because they don't want it. Now, if they want the pacifist community's resources but not the libertarian community's resources, then the libertarians' ability to defend doesn't enter into the equation. Now, obviously, now if you then say, okay, you can't provide that kind of defense, is that then lacking? Yeah, it's lacking, and you can't. You sort of put restraints on what you can and cannot do. But by the same token, someone could say that if you take the non-aggression axiom and all the other libertarian principles, one would leave oneself at comparative weakness vis-a-vis a society, say a minarchist state that had taxation and conscription. So, I mean, the argument proves too much, because vis-a-vis a state that has a minarchy and conscription, the libertarian society would be defective and that it couldn't adequately protect itself.
However, there's a large difference in the likely requirements of. There's a large difference between a general pacifist approach to everything and a libertarian anarchist community which say, well, basically we just won't invade you, but if you attack us, we'll attack you in defense. So whilst you might not go out and extract forcible resources or go on any invasions in any particular area, I mean, yeah, they might not carpet bomb the country who's invading them, for example, to kill all the civilians, because that would clearly be disproportionate. The amount of violence that they would be willing to use, and being consistent with libertarian principles, would be in quantity significantly higher than the amount of violence that the pacifist community would be willing to engage in without them breaking their principles. So on a level of magnitude, it would seem that the libertarian society has a much better chance of protecting itself.
That might very well be true, but then a state with conscription and taxation would have a comparatively higher means to protect itself than the libertarian society.
Yes, but there's a difference between actually doing some defense and basically no defense. And I know, yes, you can make the other particular claims about, hugging the guy, which might work in certain circumstances. I'm not saying it couldn't. But I do think there's going to be in practice a large difference in quantity of. I'll put it this way: the way I view things is there's going to be, in many cases, an amount of violence which is required to repel a threat, and in most cases, that bar is highly unlikely to get anyone close to violating libertarian principles. Whereas I see that significantly higher for the pacifist community, and so the pacifist community therefore is going to be much more likely to, or much less of a chance of surviving as a pacifist community than with the libertarian community.
Well, I mean, this is where, again, I find this line of inquiry problematic, because as almost all the leading libertarian thinkers have admitted, there has not yet been a truly libertarian society that has ever existed. So for whatever reason, forces have conspired to prevent such a society from developing. Whereas, I don't want to say there's been very many, but there have been a few societies that have held to the principles that I'm now elucidating, and they have survived. So the fact that often very brutal persecution, like from the Catholics and the Lutherans in Reformation Europe. So I don't see how that follows, because what we actually see is that, for whatever reason, the libertarian society can't even coalesce, let alone defend itself. Whereas, so to even grant that ceteris paribus, it would be better, well, it doesn't even exist yet. So, I mean, I'm comparing an actual system to a hypothetical system. That doesn't seem to be a fair comparison.
All I'd say to that is, all I'm interested in here is the principal differences between them, if they were to exist, and if they were not to, is another question. And the reason I use libertarian society as a comparative point is that you have made multiple critiques of them, so I thought it was legitimate, therefore, to compare it with the pacifist community, which is why I was using it as the standard.
Yes, if you're defining it so narrowly that if you invent a thought experiment where you need to use violence to live and you don't use violence, therefore you die, yes, that would happen. But anybody can invent a thought experiment like that. What if I invented a thought experiment where you had to use conscription? Otherwise, you get conquered and enslaved and murdered. Well, the libertarian would say, well, that's just the price we have to pay for our principles of not having conscription. And I'm like, fine, okay, there's a point where everybody makes that decision, and this is at the point where I make that decision.
I think the amount of violence I'm talking about here is quite practical and is not as theoretical as you are claiming. This, even though the libertarian community might be sort of a theoretical construct as such, the amount of violence that would be required would seem to be much more practical than the situation where you have to have conscription or you die. But I think we've kind of gone through that point. Unless you have anything else you want to add on there.
On defense? No, I don't think so. Well, actually, the last thing I would add about defense is it also depends on how unpopular you are. And I think a lot of people, with the rising tide of nationalist tendencies, nationalism with regards to economics, and socialist tendencies, a libertarian society would, for better or for worse, be probably unpopular with its neighbors. And that would probably leave it more exposed. Whereas I don't think, at least, I mean, in the Reformation, yes, being a pacifist was very unpopular, and we would be in the position that the libertarians would probably be in today. But I don't think it would be the same now. I think that they would be less disliked, and therefore less likely to attract the attention of these predatory agencies.
Okay, so my fourth question is this. How can you argue for the prohibition of things like prostitution and abortion, but in principle refuse to wield the power of the governing apparatus to enforce it?
Well, the idea is like this. When you look at what Romans 13 says the state should do, the state should punish the wicked and protect the righteous. And so telling the state to live up to its mandate is to tell those who are in authority to live up to the mandate that they've been given is a consistent theme throughout Old and New Testaments. So we see that John the Baptist condemned Herod for his marrying his brother's wife. In the Old Testament, Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar to do justice, therefore you might be able to postpone or avert God's judgment. So it's in the office that they have chosen for themselves. They have a certain set of obligations that they are required to do by God, and telling them what that is and when they've deviated from that is part of the Christian witness as a whole.
But wouldn't forcibly stopping things like prostitution and abortion, let's suppose you do it on the hang on, I think this is going to be more fruitful. Let me move to a slightly different question, which I think will bring the differences out here, I think, better, which would be this one, which was within a pacifist community, what punishment options are open to the judge following a crime or tort? So if you're within a pacifist community, what would be the legitimate recourse would you have?
So there's a few options on the table here. I don't remember the name of it, but there was a science fiction novel that was on the list of libertarian science fiction novels. I think it was called And Then There Were None, where Earth sends the Earth government sends a spaceship to other worlds to bring them back into the fold, and it fails miserably doing so. But one planet they meet is the Gand planet, followers of Mahatma Gandhi, and what they do is they just they have a sort of gift economy where they trade favors and so on and so on. If you transgress any of the rules within that society, then essentially your standing is wiped out. You don't have any. Nobody owes you any more favors. You can't claim any favors. Nobody's obligated to do any favors for you, and you're essentially just isolated. And that kind of social pressure is one way that you could do it. The other way is what Paul calls the ban, where you refuse to even talk to these people. Peter talks about that as well, and they just become non-persons in the community. So unless they're able to sustain themselves in the wilderness or find other like-minded people to create a new community, it would be very difficult for them to survive under such pressure. Now, as far as taking any legal actions, the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians, I think 6, prescribes that Christians should not take legal action against one another or against pagans.
Okay, so just to deal with the latter thing first. I was assuming here that we have a Christian pacifist community, and there was some form of a crime which took place within it. So I'd presume there'd be some sort of dispute resolution that would take place. And so what would the appropriate course of action be from the Christian pacifist judge, as opposed to the situation in which Paul was writing, in which you'd almost certainly go to pagan courts, as opposed to yourselves?
Yeah, okay. So I'll answer. I guess there's two questions embedded in here. The first one is, assuming there's no outside jurisdiction that could lay claim to this dispute, and it's just a purely intra dispute. The way it would go, the hearing would be that on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, guilt would be attained. So if guilt could not be attained on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, or maybe something equivalent like forensic evidence, the case would be dropped. Now there might be the idea he did it, but we can't prove it, in which case we can't necessarily do the full expulsion from the community, where you're expelled from the community, but some other measures of maybe not being quite as friendly to the person, or willing to help out, because there's a sort of pall that hangs over them. But if it could be proven that this person committed this offense, then depending on the gravity or severity of the offense, some form of prescribed penance, if it's some sort of petty crime or something. But if it's a more serious crime, then expulsion from the community would be the punishment. Also, as Christ taught, settle out of court. So oftentimes if you have 2 contending individuals, one of them or both of them, the general culture would encourage people to settle out of court before it even gets there. That could be private arbitration. Doesn't necessarily have to be. I mean, it could just be, what do I have to pay you to just, smooth this over so we can move on with life? So I think there's a spectrum within that area. But let's say also there's an overlapping authority on top that could lay claim to this offender and say, hey, we need to arrest this offender because he's broken our laws. Well, then, unlike, say, what happened in the Middle Ages with the controversy between the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire and who would punish, say, a disobedient cleric, we would just say, look, the legitimate authority in that area, if guilt could be proven, would be given the authority to punish them, would be given access to that individual to punish according to their own lights.
Okay, so let's suppose the more interesting case, I think, is if the pacifist community has sole jurisdiction for whatever reason. They have control in their area, and so there's no other jurisdiction that can lay claim to any malefactor. So if you do prescribe banishment, how do you stop them from coming back?
Well, there wouldn't be a whole lot you could do to prevent them from coming back, but you would create conditions such that they couldn't really exist. If we pursued the policy that the Gans did, and then there were none, it's difficult to imagine how he could survive coming back.
Because of the level of ostracism, etc., etc.
Exactly.
Okay, so suppose that was the let's suppose that was the penalty. What if some members of the community decided not to abide by it? Would that then incur any form of criminal penalty, or well, within the pacifist jurisdiction, what they would consider criminal? Because I can imagine how that could work, but I can imagine very easily how it could break down.
So you're saying, like, if somebody just, one person or multiple people just decide to quit playing by the rules? Well, I mean, ultimately, that's a problem that all societies have. What if people just suddenly all quit playing the rules? That point, society is about to break down, and a lot of mistakes have been made up to that point. Ideally, if it's not too far gone, you'd like to quarantine in the sense that the sort of ostracism measures are in place such that the people who already left would be clearly marked as, you don't have dealings with this, which would then discourage other people from doing so.
Yes, you could do that. My thought is that whilst ostracism could work in particular communities, if you had one where it had a relative level of economic development such that people could be relatively economically independent and weren't as dependent on their neighbor and they may do in a more agrarian society. And furthermore, if you have the internet, for example, that would facilitate quite easily ways around ostracism. So I'm not sure how well that would work if you were to have a somewhat technologically advanced pacifist community.
One of the things that is sort of implied is when you look at how earlier societies function, where you relied on trust between kinsmen, tribesmen, and clans rather than commercial interactions between strangers. One of the things that you got was, of course, this sort of built-in security system where it's like, okay, they're just gonna, your house burns down, everybody shows up. That's what you do. Everybody just does it. We see with the Amish, with their very high in-group preference and their very high level of social safety net set up within their own system, such that, yeah, you could leave, and some people, in fact, do leave to a more highly developed technical United States. But you are giving up a lot, and there really isn't any comparable safety net to what the Amish person will be giving up by going out into the world at large. I mean, you might be able to find something like that in the Mormon communities, possibly, but in general, you're not going to have that. And you can get a kind of similitude of it with commercial transaction with strangers, but that has a whole other set of costs and difficulties associated with it that I think we have good reason to believe would make it less desirable for the individual to want to leave from this community to that community, realizing what that would entail giving up.
Okay, so would you say that in general then the pacifist community is likely then to be less technologically advanced than the non-pacifist community? And so would it have got to industrialization on its own, or would it have been likely to remain more of an agrarian society?
Now, again, if we envision a society, because I think the context in which this question is asked is the same context as the last one. If for some reason there was no state or gang or raider authority on top, and we really were just the only authority in the area. I don't know if I could answer that because we don't really have any examples like that. But I would argue that in one sense, not having resources taken by taxes or by raiders and not devoting resources to armaments production would lead more discretionary resources to be invested elsewhere. But then the question is, how would that have been done? Would they have then chose to then invest that into more technological development? I think it's a possibility, because if you look at, say, Hutterite organization practices in the 16th century, they sort of operated in a fashion that the Marxists wish they could. That, after working the day, they would then in the evening, read up on new techniques of production, new techniques of organization, and then they would then implement that into the future. Now, if you could do that without any sort of external pressures, external human pressures preventing you from refining those techniques, I suppose in theory some form of industrialization could have occurred. But then, would there be other countervailing forces that would mitigate against it? I could see it going either way. I don't really have a firm answer on would it have gone industrial or not. I think probably not, because industrialization really was closely tied to the state and the state apparatus creating conditions under which these corporations could function. And absent that, it's difficult to envision how they could be created. And also the nature of how some of these corporations function. So, for example, with the West Virginia coal mine wars, they actually called on the National Guard to put down the strikes. Obviously, that would not be available to this community. I think it would tend to be smaller scale production, which would not necessarily prevent technological innovation, but would probably slow it down.
Even though if it was slower and you had a greater sophisticated economy, which was based more on exchange and not sort of personal trust, would you say that is a necessary result of economic sophistication, that you no longer have as much reliance on bonds of trust between a group of people? Would you say that was a necessary result of increased economic development, or could you say that you could have a similar level of development whilst maintaining those?
I think you could, but I also think depending on how the capital is developed, it could make it more difficult. So if you have a more localized mode of production, then it would be, I think, easier to do it. Whereas if it was more diffuse and sort of like global or national, and you had to deal with people, many far away, it becomes increased. The further away the people you're doing business are from you, the harder and harder it is to rely on these sort of overlapping ties of fealty and obligation. And so if it were the case that a highly sophisticated technological society would require an economic system that you have to deal with people all over the world, then it would be very, very difficult. I wouldn't say impossible, because again, to maintain such a culture, because obviously you could make that your priority and then work to compensate. But it would be more difficult correspondingly if it were the case that you have to have these networks that are global. Now, at this point, I think we need to wrap it up because it's been about an hour. So I would say thank you, Swithun, for coming on. And till next time, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.